The first time they saw her kneel by the camp fence, it looked innocent, almost tender. A small woman, a shadow of her former self, whispering softly in Japanese as she slid scraps of stew through the mesh to the camp's half-blind hound. Every night at sundown, without fail. The guards joked she'd made herself a pet, but then one evening when a pair of Texan MPs followed her, just out of curiosity, they saw her do something they couldn't explain. The dog, belly low to the ground, didn't eat the food. He waited, and then the woman reached beneath the hem of her uniform, pulled out a folded scrap of cloth, and tucked it beneath the dog's collar. The MPs blinked. A message? To whom? The woman turned, eyes hollow, and smiled in a way that made one of them shiver. This wasn't kindness. It was something else, something older and much more dangerous. The camp sat low and wide across a stretch of windswept plains, nestled between dusty hills and cattle fences that looked older than the war itself. Camp Elkhorn had once been a ranch, and it still smelled faintly of hay and horses, though now the barns had been turned into storage depots and the main corral into a military checkpoint. The barbed wire fences stretched taut across the land like the lines on a weary face, tight, orderly, but never cruel. This was not a place of brutality. It was a place of silence. The guards were mostly Texans, too old or too injured for combat, men with slow drawls and leathered hands who treated war like a storm that had passed overhead and left them to clean up after. They didn't carry whips, just clipboards and coffee thermoses. When the Japanese women arrived, there was no yelling, no boots slammed against the ground, just names called out one by one, and beds assigned in hushed English that few understood. Most of the women had come from the ruins of Manila, Saipan, and once Imperial Tokyo, transported by ship across the Pacific in rattling convoys, their ranks made up not of soldiers, but stenographers, nurses, and radio assistants, the quiet machinery behind the Japanese war effort. They arrived thin, gray-skinned, eyes hollow from hunger and surrender, and among them was Misaki Nakamura, who said little, kept her head low, and avoided both the guards and her fellow prisoners with equal precision. She was the kind of woman who made herself disappear without moving. Short, plain, her dark hair tied back in a tight knot that seemed more functional than personal. She had no particular accent, no distinguishing features beyond a small scar just below her right ear, and even that was half hidden by the collar of her uniform. She asked for nothing. She smiled at no one. Within days, the others began to forget she was there at all, which, as it turned out, was exactly what she wanted. She volunteered for kitchen duty by raising her hand without a word. The American sergeant running the mess hall, a barrel-chested man named Tucker, who missed his wife's cornbread more than he missed combat, accepted with a shrug. "Let her," he said. "Quiet ones don't break plates." And she didn't. Misaki worked with the calm of someone folding paper, slicing onions, scrubbing pots, organizing supplies like she had been doing it her whole life. She never ate until the others were fed. She never spoke unless spoken to. The kitchen staff took to calling her Mouse. And then there was the dog, a mangy old hound missing half a tail and blind in one eye had wandered into camp sometime that winter and never left. No one knew who he belonged to. He slept beneath the supply shed, showed up at roll call like a joke, and accepted scraps with a regal sort of patience. Most days he was ignored, but not by Misaki. Every evening, just after supper, she'd wrap a portion of leftover stew or rice in a napkin and slip out the back door of the kitchen, walking slow, deliberate steps toward the rear fence. There, just beyond the shadows of the floodlight, the dog would wait. Not barking, Not begging, just waiting. She would kneel, fold the napkin open on the ground, and place the food gently before him. Then she would rest one hand on his head, always the same spot, just above the eye that still worked, and whisper, the same word, always the same, Ikiro. No one noticed at first. In a camp where days blurred into each other and silence was mistaken for order, it was easy to miss the rituals. But over time, one of the younger guards began to ask questions. "Why's she always feeding that dog?" he asked one night, leaning against the fence with a cigarette. Tucker shrugged. "Hell probably reminds her of home. Let her be." And so they let her. For weeks, months. Misaki fed the dog every night like it was a sacred duty. The other women said nothing. The Americans saw only kindness. No one thought to ask what else she might be feeding. No one thought to wonder why the dog never ate right away. And no one noticed the way Misaki's hand lingered beneath his collar. Before she was Mouse, before the grease-stained apron and the muttered English in an American mess hall, she had been something else entirely. In Tokyo, she had worn a uniform crisp with starch and a badge that bore no rank but opened every door. Misaki Nakamura was not a soldier. She was a ghost in the intelligence corps, the kind of officer whose name was never recorded on transport manifests, whose files were sealed in cabinets bolted shut even before the war was lost. She had translated American troop intercepts long before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. She had sat in concrete rooms beneath the Kudan Hill Intelligence Center where maps curled from humidity and sweat never dried. She had not just read the enemy's words. She had heard their intentions, sifted meaning from slang, dissected every idiom until nothing sounded like innocence. She once spent an entire week breaking down a single phrase from a captured American radio call, "Package dropped." It had turned out to mean nothing more than supplies delivered to a stranded patrol, but the process of decoding every word had felt like unspooling the mind of the man who spoke it. She had grown intimate with voices she would never see. And then came the raid. The sky over Tokyo had turned red before the sirens even wailed. Misaki had been at her desk, translating a radio intercept when the first rumble started, low and strange, like thunder that didn't belong to any season. She stood, confused, and then the building shook. Not once, not twice, but again and again, until the walls peeled back like paper. A firebomb burst through the far windows, and then the floor was gone. The room, her world, folded inward. She woke beneath a slab of broken roof, the air so hot it burned to breathe. Someone was crying nearby, a wet, animal sound. She tried to move. Her legs didn't answer. Only her right arm still worked, scraped raw to the bone. She used it to pull herself through the wreckage toward the open air. Of her unit, 12 women, all trained in silence and secrecy. Only 3 made it out. 1 died within the hour. Another never spoke again. Misaki, miraculously, had no broken bones, just burns, bruises, and silence swelling inside her like a second heartbeat. They were ordered to report to the ministry the next day. But there was no ministry left. The city burned for 3 nights. What didn't turn to ash collapsed. That's when she made her decision. A week later, assigned to help escort wounded soldiers aboard a supply ship bound for the Philippines, she removed her ID badge, scratched the name from her papers, and rewrote her own life with the stroke of a pencil. She became Mizue Tanaka, a nurse, born in Nagasaki. Poor English. No military clearance. When the Americans captured their vessel during the retreat from Luzon, she offered no resistance. She knelt, she bowed, she gave her name without hesitation. Tanaka, Mizue, nurse. The American officer, nodded, wrote it down, and moved on. In that moment, she erased herself. Not from shame, from survival. She had read enough decoded orders to know what happened to those deemed intelligence assets. They disappeared. Quietly, permanently. So she let them see her as small, let them forget her. She became a blur at the edge of their vision, helpful, silent, harmless. A woman good with a knife and a ladle, not with codes and ciphers. But the truth didn't vanish. It nested in her like smoke, acrid, clinging. Every time she saw a map, her eyes flicked toward the coordinates. Every time someone said radio, her spine tightened. She knew which frequencies were safe, which ones lied. And each night, as she placed scraps beneath the old dog's head, she remembered that night in Tokyo. The flash of light, the weight of concrete on her chest, the scream that never reached her mouth. Misaki Nakamura had died in that fire. Mizue Tanaka had survived. And yet, somehow, the real name still pressed against the back of her teeth. Not quite gone, just waiting. At Camp Elkhorn, most days passed like pages in a book someone forgot to finish. The guards, mostly Texas boys, carried themselves less like soldiers and more like men used to fence posts and long rides under brutal sun. They spat tobacco into empty cans, played cards under floodlights, and addressed even the highest-ranking female prisoners as ma'am, not out of deference, but out of habit. Their uniforms were always a little too loose, boots always dusted in the soft red earth that caked everything. They'd come from ranches, sheriff's offices, feed stores, and now found themselves watching over foreign women who barely looked at them. They didn't like roughness. One sergeant had even written home saying he felt like he was babysitting ghosts. And maybe he was. The Japanese prisoners drifted through the camp in near silence, heads down, hands folded. Misaki was just one more shadow, until the dog started bringing things back. First it was a small handkerchief, folded twice and tucked under his collar. Then a paper scrap. Tucker, the mess hall sergeant, chalked it up to superstition. "She's lonely," he muttered, watching Misaki through the window. "Talking to a dog's better than talking to nobody." But when the dog came back carrying a silk ribbon, one dyed imperial navy blue, the exact shade used in rank sashes, someone finally said something. A letter was sent. Then a call. And 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning so clear the sky looked like porcelain, a military jeep rolled through the camp gates, carrying a lieutenant with clean boots and colder eyes. He wore no dust on his uniform, no familiarity in his posture. The patch on his sleeve didn't belong to the Ranchland MPs. It belonged to Military Intelligence Division, Pacific Theater. His name was Lieutenant Harold G. Donlin, and he carried a list of 27 names. All Japanese women, all presumed captured, most believed dead. One of those names was Nakamura Misaki. The guards gathered around the open-air office as Donlin read off his list. They shook their heads at most. Too old, too young, not here. But when he asked about the dog, about the woman who fed it, someone finally paused. "That'd be Mouse," said a corporal with a toothpick between his lips. "Real quiet one. Says her name's Tanaka." Donlin didn't blink, just wrote the name down and underlined it once. He asked to see her. Not in a cell, not under threat, just observed. So they watched. At sunset, they followed Misaki's slow walk to the back fence. The dog met her halfway, ears low, tail wagging in slow circles. She knelt, unwrapped a napkin of stew, and pressed her fingers against his collar. Donlin narrowed his eyes. "She's not just feeding him." The next day he returned to headquarters with 2 of the dog's napkins in sealed bags. On one, faded kanji could barely be seen. Weathered from time and paw prints, The other held nothing, but the implication was clear. Someone was passing messages. The camp guards didn't know what to believe. "She don't talk," Tucker said later, chewing the edge of his mustache. "She just works. Don't seem the spy type." But the name changed everything. Misaki Nakamura was not a name you forgot. Intelligence files listed her as an interpreter stationed in Tokyo, cleared for Operation Thunderclap, and several decoded American transmissions during the Guadalcanal campaign. She had vanished the night of the Tokyo firebombing, presumed dead, and now, maybe, she was feeding scraps to a dog in Texas. The guards started to pay closer attention. One sat by the mess hall window every evening, pretending to read. Another followed the Hound at dawn, watching where he wandered. They never found anything, just dirt, empty cans, maybe a button lost in the grass. But the tension changed. The silence around Misaki was no longer comfortable. It was electric. What had seemed like mourning now looked like mission. And the dog, once a joke, now wandered the camp like a courier. Only Misaki's face remained unchanged, calm, unreadable, and endlessly still. She moved through the camp like smoke, present but never graspable. Misaki never raised her voice. She answered when called, nodded when spoken to, but never volunteered a word, a smile, or even a sigh. Some said she might be mute, others just proud. The truth was neither. Misaki heard everything, saw everything, and chose silence like armor. It wasn't shyness, it was strategy. She had survived one war by disappearing into silence. She wasn't about to risk another by speaking out of turn. The other women kept their distance, not out of fear, more out of uncertainty. Misaki didn't gossip in the laundry lines or hum along to the Japanese lullabies someone sang softly in the barracks at night. She did her chores with exactness, as if each sweep of the broom were a character in some forgotten prayer. When the guards came around with their daily routines, inspections, roll calls, medical check-ins, she stood at attention, not rigid like a soldier, but still as a pond untouched by wind. The chaplain tried once. He was a soft-spoken man from Ohio, more farmer than priest, who believed that even in war, a little kindness could go a long way. One afternoon he approached her at the edge of the camp garden with a Japanese translation of the Bible, its pages slightly yellowed from the supply room shelf. He offered it with both hands, respectfully. She bowed in return, not deeply, just enough for her eyes to flick downward, and did not take it. The refusal was gentle, polite, almost beautiful in its control, but unmistakable. He never tried again. "Woman don't need saving," he said later, folding the book shut. "She's already made peace with something." But the guards weren't so sure. They watched her closer now. One noticed she always dried her hands before touching the dog. Another pointed out she never fed him leftovers from the women's meals, only from the officers'. When questioned, she merely blinked. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't apology. It was nothing, except when she was with the dog. Then something changed. She would kneel beside him, fingers brushing through his coarse fur like she was searching for something lost in its folds. Her back curved, her face tilted low, lips moving in whispers the guards could never quite catch. She never looked over her shoulder, never acknowledged she was being watched, but the tenderness in her gestures was unmistakable. She fed the dog not like it was a creature, but like it was an altar, each motion deliberate, almost sacred. They tried catching her off guard, switching guards, standing closer. But it didn't matter. She gave them nothing. No fear, no guilt, just quiet. Once, a young MP, maybe 20, soft-eyed and new to the boredom of guarding women who didn't talk, offered her a piece of chocolate from his rations. He'd seen her watching him eat it earlier, just for a second. When he held it out, unwrapped and melting slightly in the Texan sun, she blinked, tilted her head, and placed her hands together in front of her like in prayer, then turned and walked away. He never tried again, either. The guards began to speculate in whispers. Some thought she was a spy. Others thought she'd gone mad from grief. A few believed she was just playing at mystery to protect herself. But whatever the reason, one thing was certain. She was hiding something, and the dog knew what it was. He stayed near her bunk, slept curled under the mess hall porch when she was inside, never barked at her, never flinched, and when she knelt at the fence each evening, whispering Ikiro like it was a spell, he listened, as if he understood a language no man in that camp had ever learned. The night it happened was windless, so still that the dust on the ground seemed to hold its breath. Private Elroy Carter, a lanky ranch boy barely older than 20, had drawn perimeter check for the late shift. He walked with his rifle slung low, boots crunching softly against gravel, when he saw the familiar shadow trot past the mess hall porch. The old hound moved with purpose, nose low, tail straight, not wandering for scraps as usual, but following a narrow path along the fence line. Something in the dog's gait, tense, unhesitating, made Carter pause. He ducked behind a water tank, watching. The dog slipped into the dark behind the supply shed, a rickety structure built from warped boards that creaked even in the gentlest breeze. Carter hesitated. The hound had never gone back there before, not that he'd seen. With a tightening in his throat, he followed. What he found almost made him drop his flashlight. Beneath the shed, hidden behind a loose plank of wood, lay a small but deliberate cache. Folded cloth scraps marked with brush strokes of Japanese kanji, charcoaled sketches of antenna structures, and a series of symbols arranged in a strict pattern, the unmistakable structure of an imperial cipher. The cloth smelled faintly of smoke and something older, like cedar or camphor. Carter's hands shook as he lifted one corner carefully, revealing more layers underneath. A map fragment, a corner of military stationery, a strip of ribbon dyed in imperial blue. Nothing about it belonged in a kitchen. Nothing belonged in a camp for women who were supposed to be clerks and nurses. He backed away, breath catching. Was she sending messages? Was the dog delivering them? Or had she spent her nights recreating memories of a world that had burned long before she ever set foot in America? He brought the scraps to Sergeant Tucker, who woke the night shift and swore under his breath for a solid minute. When Lieutenant Donlin saw the materials at dawn, his jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "These are not random," he said, tapping the cipher with one gloved finger. "Someone who knew how to read our intercepts would know how to rewrite them." That someone had to be Misaki, or Mizue, as she called herself. Carter felt a cold weight in his stomach. Was she trying to make contact with Japanese holdouts somewhere, or reliving duties she could not let go of? Was she staging a quiet campaign, or simply building a shrine to a past she could not bury? The war had ended months ago. The Emperor had spoken, surrender had been declared, yet someone here acted like it hadn't, and the dog, the poor blind old hound, had become the vessel of her secrets. The guards gathered in low clusters throughout the day, their conversations hushed and uneasy. Some swore she was a spy pretending to be broken. Others whispered that maybe she wasn't dangerous at all, just shattered by everything she had lost. "She feeds the dog like she's feeding a ghost," Carter muttered. "Maybe she thinks someone's still listening." but a deeper question gnawed at them. What loyalty survived defeat? When a nation fell, did its servants fall with it, or did some part of duty continue beating inside those who once lived by it? Misaki had worn silence like a uniform, but the cash suggested something louder, something determined. Perhaps she wasn't serving the Emperor anymore. Perhaps she was serving memory or grief or a promise made long before her name was erased and rewritten. Lieutenant Donlan closed the box of confiscated scraps and said quietly, "Whatever she's doing, it didn't end with surrender." And suddenly, every whisper she gave the dog at dusk sounded less like mourning and more like a warning. They brought her in just after sunrise. She didn't resist, didn't speak. She walked calmly between two guards, her hands not bound, but her steps slow, deliberate. In the small holding room, they seated her on a wooden chair with uneven legs. Dust floated in the air like suspended ash. Misaki sat with her hands folded in her lap and stared at the wall. When Sergeant Tucker asked her directly, "What were you doing with those cloths?" she said nothing. Not silence in defiance, silence like ritual. Lieutenant Donlan watched from the corner, arms crossed. He had seen trained operatives break within minutes. Misaki showed no sign of stress, no twitch, no dry mouth. Her pulse, as measured later by the camp medic, remained steady as a sleeping child's. They tried Japanese, then English, then both. Nothing. 2 hours later, they brought in a translator from another base, a Nisei, Japanese-American, trained in both language and culture. She sat across from Misaki and gently introduced herself. She told her where she was from, Fresno, and how her own parents had been in camps too, though in America. Misaki blinked once, then looked away. Still not a word. Even when presented with the cash, the cloths, the cipher, Misaki gave them only the soft absence of reaction. "She's either been trained to resist interrogation," the translator muttered under her breath, "or she's beyond caring." They moved her to solitary confinement, not as punishment, but in the hopes isolation might loosen her grip. But something strange happened in that silence. A guard passing her cell one evening heard it first. 2 notes, repeated softly, hummed with the tenderness of a lullaby. At first he thought it was nothing, a tune without shape, but the repetition made it unforgettable. 2 rising notes, then pause, 2 again, always the same. By the 3rd day another guard recognized it, faint but familiar. He whistled it out loud to a chaplain's aide, who blinked, startled. "That's not just a tune," he said slowly. "That's a song." They traced it back through Army music files and Japanese wartime recordings. It was an old imperial farewell march, not the official anthem, but one sung quietly among soldiers before departure. The kind used when men boarded submarines with no return orders. A tune without lyrics, because it didn't need any. Everyone who heard it already knew what it meant. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't grief. It was farewell. The humming unsettled the guards more than silence ever had. They took turns outside her door, exchanging theories. "What if she's sending a message?" one asked. "To who?" said another. "The war's over." "But she doesn't act like it is." It became clear to Donlan that this wasn't about enemy action anymore. It was something harder to name, a belief so deep it survived the fall of the country that birthed it. Was she clinging to a vanished cause? Or had she come here on a mission no one could understand, not even her? He reviewed her file again and again. Each time he circled the phrase, interpreter, high clearance, not a spy, not a saboteur, a woman who'd known the secrets of war, not through weapons, but through words. And now, when asked for those words, she refused them. It was as if language itself had become the enemy. Donlin wondered, not for the first time, whether the silence was her defense or her final act of loyalty. She hadn't broken, she hadn't betrayed. But the song told a story anyway, a story that made the Americans ask themselves what it meant to win a war, if the defeated still refused to surrender. The folder sat unopened on Donlin's desk for days. He couldn't explain why. Inside were the documents taken from the shed, marked, sorted, translated. Most were military in tone, some impossible to decipher. But there was one that didn't fit. It had been folded into quarters, tied with a thin thread, and tucked into a clean cloth. No seal, no stamp, just a name at the top, written in brush script, too delicate for code. "Dear Haruki," it began. Misaki had written the letter in tiny, orderly characters, the sort used in schoolbooks. No encryption, no jargon, just the words of a sister. She spoke of days passing in quiet, of wind through fences, of stew that smelled like burnt garlic. She mentioned the hound, whom she had named Goma, Sesame, because of the speckled gray on his ears. "I feed him like I fed you," she wrote. "He listens the same way, head tilted, patient." Each letter ended the same. "If you find this, I'll wait." Donlin read the letter twice, then a third time, then called the translator. They read it together, line by line. There were no orders, no intelligence, no schemes, just memory. A single footnote in the intelligence file confirmed what the letter hinted at. Misaki's younger brother, Private First Class Haruki Nakamura, had been deployed to Burma in late 1943 as a field runner for a communications platoon attached to the 33rd Japanese Army. He vanished during the Allied assault near Meiktila and was listed as MIA, presumed dead. But there had been no confirmation, no remains, just silence. For Misaki, silence had become the only form of truth. She had sent letter after letter, not through mail or Morse, but through ritual, folded scraps, tied to a dog's collar, hidden where no one looked. The diagrams of towers weren't instructions. They were fragments of the last signals she remembered intercepting. Messages she couldn't forget, not because they mattered strategically, but because they were the last echoes of a voice she believed still existed somewhere out there. Every message was a prayer, every cipher a tombstone. She wasn't resisting, the translator said, voice low. She was mourning. The realization spread through the camp with quiet shame. Suddenly, Misaki wasn't a figure of mystery or threat. She was a sister, locked in a grief so vast it had to be disguised to survive. Her silence wasn't defiance. It was language she no longer trusted to carry what needed saying. The humming, the feeding, the repetition. It wasn't espionage. It was endurance, a ritual built to keep her brother alive, if only in her imagination. The guards felt it first. They stopped watching her like a suspect. They began leaving extra bread by the dog bowl. One even tied a small red ribbon to Goma's collar. Not for code, but for color. Something living. Sergeant Tucker, the first to suspect her, began lighting a cigarette each evening and sitting by the fence, just out, a view, listening for the tune. And it still came, soft and fragile. 2 notes, a pause. Not a song of empire, a song of someone who had not been told how to stop loving someone who never came home. In the end, all Misaki had wanted was for someone somewhere to hear her. Even if that someone had 4 legs and a blind eye, even if he never left the fence. The dog was found just after dawn, curled beneath the shadow of the kitchen steps. His chest no longer rose, his mouth slightly open as if mid-breath, eyes shut like sleep. One of the cooks spotted him first, set down her crate of potatoes, and whispered a quiet curse under her breath. Within the hour, the news had spread. Goma was gone. No one told Misaki directly. They didn't have to. She came out at her usual time that evening, not early, not late, and walked to the same spot near the outer fence. She carried a bowl of stew, same as always, and knelt in the dust. But where the dog had once waited, there was only air. She placed the bowl down anyway. She didn't cry, didn't even blink fast. Her face remained as still as ever, but her lips moved, slow, careful, intentional. "Ikiro," she whispered, "live." The guards stood back, watching. For the first time, none of them spoke. No orders barked, no sideways glances or notes taken. The silence held its own kind of reverence. Misaki sat there longer than usual, unmoving, eyes fixed on the space where the dog had once laid his head. Eventually, Sergeant Tucker stepped forward. He knelt beside her, slowly, not to interrogate but to accompany. From his coat pocket, he pulled a dented tin bowl filled with fresh stew. Without a word, he placed it beside hers and stood again. She didn't eat. She didn't touch it. She just whispered the word again. Ikiro. Only this time it was clear the word wasn't for the dog. It was for herself. The guards didn't know what to do with the grief that filled the yard like fog. She had no family here, no grave to tend, no flag to salute. The dog had been her tether to something beyond the wire. Now, even that was gone. Some thought she might stop showing up at the fence. But the next night she returned. No bowl this time, just her hands folded in her lap. She sat in the dust again, whispering words too soft to catch. It became a ritual again, but different now. No offering, only presence. A few of the guards began rotating their shifts so they could be nearby during that hour. One brought her a blanket as the nights grew colder. Another left dried flowers by the fence post. They didn't speak to her. They didn't expect her to speak back. But their gestures were something close to apology, not for what they'd done, but for what none of them could fix. Misaki had surrendered nothing in the interrogation room, but she was surrendering something now. Not to them, to time, to loss, to the truth that even loyalty couldn't hold back death. That week, the chaplain said a few words near the old oak tree where they buried Goma. Misaki did not attend, but later someone found a small scrap of paper folded at the base of the tree. It had no words, just a brush-painted paw print and a single kanji character below it. Life. The past had claimed everything from her name, her family, her country, but it hadn't taken that last word, Ikiro. Even if no one answered back, even if she had to say it alone. If this story moved you, give the video a like and leave a comment below, telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your thoughts matter. By spring, the kitchen staff no longer flinched when Misaki entered. She no longer moved like a ghost. She began to nod in greeting, sometimes even murmuring a quiet, "Thank you," when handed a bowl or apron. The change came not in thunderclaps, but in whispers, barely noticed at first, but unmistakable in hindsight. It began with a simple phrase. One morning, after helping rewrap a burn on a fellow prisoner's hand, she turned to the American nurse and said, "You kind." 2 words, stiff, halting, but they echoed louder than any sermon. The nurse smiled but didn't answer, afraid even acknowledgement might scare the words back into silence. Misaki started spending time in the infirmary, not as a patient, but as a helper. She held the hands of sick women during fevers. She sat by bunks and read out loud from old American magazines, her accent strange but steady. "Life," she read one afternoon, tracing the headline with a finger, "is like river." No one corrected her. The women in the barracks noticed, too. She had once avoided their laughter, their stories, their songs. Now she sat near the edge of the circle, listening. Occasionally she even smiled, just barely, the corner of her mouth shifting like a page turning in wind. But each evening, when the sky dimmed and the shadows returned to their long shapes, she still walked alone to the fence. She no longer carried a bowl. She brought only herself and the memory of what had been. And still she whispered. Some nights it was ikiru, some nights other words, sometimes only breath. The guards never asked any more. They respected the ritual now, the way a soldier respects a folded flag. One said it reminded him of his grandmother's prayers, though she spoke only Polish and believed the Virgin Mary lived behind the stove. Healing, it turned out, didn't look like what they expected. It didn't come with tears. It didn't come with confession. It came with small acts, folding a blanket for an injured woman, tucking herbs under a pillow, staring up at the stars as if waiting for them to blink back. The war had ended. The papers had said so. Nations signed. Bombs ceased. Flags were lowered and raised again under new suns, but inside Misaki something still walked, still watched, still waited. Grief, unlike war, does not obey surrender. Lieutenant Donlin observed her from time to time from a respectful distance. He'd seen men broken in battle, and others stitched back together by nothing more than time and bread and laughter. But Misaki was different. She hadn't shattered. She'd sealed herself off, as if mourning was something sacred, not to be touched. One night, as the wind picked up and carried the scent of coming rain, she turned toward the barracks instead of the fence. Just once. She paused, hand resting on the post where Goma used to sit. Then she bowed, not to the fence, not to the past, but to the earth. A small, solemn gesture. Not goodbye, not forgiveness, just acknowledgment. The war was not over for her, but maybe it was quieting. Maybe the silence she once used as armor had become something else, a space wide enough for memory, for sorrow, and, slowly, for life. She left just after dawn, the same way she had arrived, quiet, without ceremony. The war was long over by then, and the repatriation order had come down through the usual channels. Misaki Nakamura, listed as non-combatant personnel, was cleared for return. Her papers were stamped. Her name, though never truly hers in the records, was restored. The other women gathered in silence as she stepped onto the transport truck. A few nodded. One bowed, low and deep. Misaki returned it gently, palms flat, no words. She carried no suitcase, only a satchel with a book and a folded scarf. What no one knew, not until hours later, was what she left behind. Inside her bunk, tucked under the thin mattress, someone found a carefully wrapped bundle. A scarf, worn, hand-stitched at the edges, cradled a small black-and-white photograph. 2 children stood beneath a cherry tree, their faces half-shadowed by sunlight. The boy wore a school uniform. Misaki stood beside him, just a step behind, as if not quite ready to catch up. Between the folds of the scarf was a note. The paper had yellowed slightly, and the ink bled just enough to soften the edges of the characters. "If you ever see him," it read, "tell him I waited." There was no signature, none needed. No one ever came forward, no brother ever found. But the bundle was not thrown away. Years passed. Camp Elkhorn was decommissioned, the barbed wire taken down, the barracks left to rot under prairie winds. Some buildings became storage sheds. Others collapsed altogether. But the photo and scarf found a new home. Not in a museum, not in a file, but in the top drawer of a desk in a small farmhouse outside Abilene. Sergeant Will Tucker, long retired, had kept the bundle. He never told his children the full story. They knew he'd guarded prisoners during the war. That was all. But sometimes, on late autumn nights, he'd open the drawer, unfold the scarf, and stare at the photograph like it was a message written in a language only silence could translate. He didn't know why he kept it. Not really. Only that, for one strange, brief season of war, an enemy had shown him something no rifle ever could. It wasn't guilt he felt, nor pride, just a kind of reverence. She hadn't spoken much, not to him, but her presence had changed the air around her, as if everything she did was part of a song only she could hear. Her grief had not asked to be seen, but it had been seen anyway, and in seeing it, something in him had changed. The world called it victory, but he knew better. War doesn't end with silence. It ends with the stories that follow us home. The scarf still smelled faintly of cedar. The photograph's edges had curled like petals. He wrapped them together, slowly, carefully, and placed them back in the drawer. Then he sat and listened for the echo of a word he never learned how to say, but somehow always understood. Ikiro, live. If this story meant something to you, give it a like and comment below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what this story made you feel.